Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello to Sean Falconer, Head of Developer Relations at Skyflow. Hey, Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. Sean is working for Skyflow, which is a company that works on, I would say, privacy as an API, right? That's what you call it. And I think it's just a very interesting story behind that, and we want to explore that a little bit today. Did I quote that right? Privacy as an API, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the spirit of what we've created is to, we always, I think the way that we usually typically describe Skyflow is we're a data privacy vault delivered as an API, which speaks to the technology sort of behind the API. But the goal is really to make data privacy as simple as, doing payments on Stripe or sending an SMS on Twilio, essentially abstracting away a lot of the complexity behind a simple API.
And I think this is a very good way to kind of find a little of a segue, into the story. So yes, it is a specific API for a specific service, and I find the story so interesting because I think we see more and more this idea of, some people call it composable enterprises, right, where an organization more and more is capable of doing the things that it does without doing it all by themselves. And Twilio and Stripe are two great examples where organizations are saying, yes, we want to do this, but we don't want to build it. So it's something where they just pull in some API. And I think the expectations are that there will be more and more organizations that are playing in that market where Skyflow is playing now, right? Like providing specific services that are very useful for a lot of companies. Could you talk just a little bit about kind of the origin story of Skyflow, so to speak? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so our CEO and founder, Anshu Sharma, he had worked previously in executive roles at Oracle as well as at Salesforce. And I think this was something, especially at Salesforce, where you're dealing with a lot of like customer data. Solving challenges around data privacy was something that he kept encountering throughout his career. And it got him thinking about like, why can't companies solve this problem? Like, why is this so difficult? And that really was something that was, I think the origins of the company was really something that was 8 years in the making, where he was an investor and he had started some other companies, but he kept kind of thinking about this problem and this challenge. And I think one of the things that he came to realize was companies like Netflix and Apple and a few other, tech giants, they had pioneered this idea of a zero trust data privacy vault. And their sort of key insight was they recognized that their customer data, which is kind of like very core to their business, is something that is different than regular application data. It's special, like it's a special type of data. And what they did was they took that customer data and they essentially moved it out of their regular application stacks and their regular application databases and moved it into this zero trust vault architecture. And when you do that, you're creating essentially like you're isolating and protecting that customer data within this vault. You're creating a single source of truth for it, but you're also completely de-scoping your existing application database from taking on the responsibility of compliance and data security for that data and moving it and sort of restricting it to this one particular area. And they pioneered this concept, but of course they built those internally. And it took years to build those and probably, I'm sure, millions of dollars to build. As one data point, Shopify spent about 3 years building their version of the vault, and with contributions from almost 100 engineers. So it's not really something you just like, throw a couple of guys at or women at over a weekend and say like, hey, can you build this? It takes a tremendous amount of investment to build something like that. And so that idea, which is, I think, recognized in privacy and security as this concept of a data privacy vault as like a best-in-class solution for data privacy, it's just not been something that's been essentially brought to market to all companies. So Skyflow was really founded around this idea, like, let's take this technology, bring it to market, make it available to all companies, and make it available as a simple API.
That is a really good story. I like that. And when I heard about Skyflow, it was one of these things where I thought like, that's a really interesting idea, because in particular, I live in Europe, and the whole idea of privacy is maybe a little bit stronger in Europe, right? So there's a lot of regulation going on. And you read about privacy all the time, and you read about like all the fines that organizations now are facing when they run into problems, and they're like, I think, percentage of revenue, and it's really, I mean, for large organizations it's a lot of money. So they really have to make sure that they do it well. And like you said, for a large organization, looking at those fines, even this investment of three years and 100 engineers, he said, that is worthwhile, right? But for a smaller org, that is not something that they can reasonably do. So one of the things I'm wondering, like when you look at the customers or the potential customers that you typically talk to or you typically see, like what is the typical profile of these companies? Because I'm guessing that, Apple is not using Skyflow. No, I don't mean this badly, but they don't have to, right?
Yeah.
But like, what's the typical profile of companies that you talk to?
I mean, I think there's a wide range. Obviously, I think, smaller technology companies, startups are going to be able to move fast with implementing something like this, and they might have especially if they're in a fintech space or in a health tech space, they know that they're storing sensitive data. If you're doing anything with financials, you need to comply with PCI regulations just to bring something to market. So they know that they have to deal with those regulations, but just to start to build a product essentially. But we certainly have a wide spectrum of really big businesses as well that are using Skyflow today, because it really doesn't make sense for most companies to build this type of architecture. Like even if you're a big, well-resourced company, you probably didn't build like a telephony integration. You're probably using something like Twilio. Like it just doesn't make sense for most companies to do that kind of investment. Or most companies don't build their own databases. Like there's
yes, that is very true.
Yeah, like there's maybe you can count on one hand the number of technology companies like Google or something like that built databases from the ground up to meet certain scale requirements. But that's not what most companies are focused on. Most companies are focused on, how do I build features for the problem that I'm trying to solve for my customers? And that's what they want to do. That's where they want to spend their resources. So it doesn't make sense to divert their resources to these sort of other things that are maybe complementary or necessary for their business to take place, but not core to actually driving ROI for their customers or for the business.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the really interesting factors of this whole API economy, right? That the number of things where you can make these build or buy decisions just gets larger and larger every week, probably, right? Where here's another thing that you can just consume externally if you want to, or you can build it yourself. It's up to you. But in many cases, and like you said, probably smaller companies and ones with more limited resources, right? It makes a lot of sense to just take these building blocks and say, okay, we want to be private. We want to do messaging. We want to do payments, right? So we just use those.
I think the other use case too is there's a lot of large companies that are not necessarily like a traditional tech company. Like you could be a huge retail company, like a Target or Walmart or something like that. You're still collecting a lot of sensitive data, but maybe you're not a traditional technology company and you don't necessarily have resources that you want to put behind building something like this. But that's a major company. So I think that is a use case that for buying versus building as well.
That's true. And if you are such a large company and you do have a privacy leak and at least you do business in Europe, right, that's going to be very expensive. So it's just in terms of risk management, right, it kind of makes sense to look at.
And I think there's the fines that come along with a situation where you have like a data breach, but there's also a loss of trust with your customers as well, which is that's like a hard thing to measure, but that hurts your business as well.
Yes, that's very true. And depending on what kind of data you're collecting, right, that this can be something that is maybe even worse, definitely, than the fines. Just a very brief question, because I'm interested, because we just recently we had like a conversation around API monetization. So the payment model. Can you just very briefly say what what Skyflow is going for? I have not looked, I have to admit that, and I don't want to go into the details, but I'm just curious, it's like, is it tiered or by volume, or like what's the general approach that you've taken here?
Yeah, so we don't charge per API call. It's one thing that is been a decision that we've made because we want people to be able to utilize their data, so they don't want to have them like fear the idea of retrieving it from the from the vault, or try to optimize not retrieving it or something like that. But the pricing model today, I would say, is somewhat still in flux. A lot of it depends on the requirements of the customer and the scale of how much data they need to store, and we have different sort of deployment models. There's a multi-tenant model, single tenant model. So you can bring your own key for encryption, or we can handle key encryption and as well as rotation. So it depends on sort of the flavor of these types of features that someone needs, and that ends up changing sort of the full story for pricing.
Yeah, and I guess you're right that in these cases, maybe having like a simple pricing sheet that you apply to everybody probably would be hard to imagine how you would do that. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm wondering, when you look at things that people want to do with this kind of data that is sitting there in the vault, just to give people a little bit of an idea what typically organizations would do with this kind of service. So what are the operations that typically organizations are going through when they use the API? What are the typical operations on this privacy data?
Yeah, so I can vary a little bit from organization to organization and sort of what their specific needs are. I would say like the like optimal scenario is essentially when you're starting to build or architect a system, having a data privacy vault is part of that conversation. Just like what kind of database you're going to use. Are you going to use cachingware or data warehouse? And data privacy vault should be part of that conversation. And essentially, what you would do there is, in the beginning, anything that is data that you wouldn't want showing up on the front page of the New York Times should go in the vault. So
that's a pretty good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yes. So it really, like, what traditionally would be your users table in your database should be, that kind of data should live in the vault. We have a bunch of, we provide sort of out of the box templates for different schemas for different types of use cases. So we support a template that sort of encapsulates all the type of PCI data, PCI related data that you might store if you're doing, banking, credit cards, KYC transactions, and so on. We also support one for healthcare or health tech. And then there's also, PII, and you can also, of course, craft your own from scratch. But a lot of it is around the level of sensitivity of the data that you're storing. But in terms of use cases, sometimes it depends, of course, on what industry the person is in. But if you take something like a PCI use case, so someone maybe is using a service like Stripe today to do payments, and the advantage of a service like Stripe is they're essentially abstracting away the complexity of payments and payment processing, which is fantastic. They give you PCI compliance out of the box, as long as you're using the secure forms for collection, and everything essentially lives within the Stripe system. But the disadvantage of that is that all your credit card data essentially is going to live within Stripe. So as companies grow, a lot of the times that might not be the optimal solution for them in terms of the amount of money that they're paying for Stripe. So maybe, or whatever payment service they're using. So they might be able to get better deals in certain countries, certain regions of the world where they want to diversify the types of payment and merchant processing systems that they use. In that case, the solution to that is, rather than your credit card data or your banking data sort of living with an individual provider, is you pull that out to the data privacy vault within Skyflow. You store that data there. That becomes the single source of truth of your customers' banking information. And then, rather than calling Stripe directly or calling Braintree or whatever, so these services that you're using, you call essentially the Skyflow vault with tokens that represent the credit card data or the banking data that are non-exploitable, sort of randomized tokens, and we will automatically detokenize those in transit and securely call Stripe or Braintree or whichever service you're using in transit, and sort of proxy those calls to those services. And then when we get the data back, we'll, essentially send that data back to you, tokenizing anything that's sensitive. So it's a way for you to avoid something called PCI lock-in, where you're sort of locking in your credit card data or banking data to a single provider. By moving it into the vault, then you can work with whoever you want. So that's a common use case, especially in like the fintech market. For something like health tech, healthcare, there's people we work with like in clinical trials. So they want to move clinical trial data into the vault, and then they want to use our data governance engine to control how different users would see that data based on the level of information that they need in order to accomplish their job. So that's really what the vault is about. Is there's the part of isolating and protecting it, which comes with all of the privacy controls, the security controls around it. But at the end of the day, you store that data so you can actually use it. So how do you use it? Well, you want to be able to govern access to it based on sort of the principles of least privilege. So thinking specifically about what is it that this service or this user needs in order to actually accomplish their job. So we see lots of examples of that where, if you think about, especially in the United States, like a situation with like a hospital where you have medical records, well, the person who's checking you in at the hospital needs a different level of access to your data than your doctor does, or the billing department needs a different level of access. Like the doctor probably doesn't need to be able to directly bill you, and the person that's checking you in at the hospital doesn't need to see your latest test results. Maybe they just need your name and some other form of verification.
And so there's a whole range of really interesting scenarios, I think. And I really like the layered example that you were giving with Stripe. Even saying like, okay, now in my composable architecture, I'm even like composing these things kind of vertically, right? Where I want to do a payment, and then I go through my privacy service, and that privacy service then again goes to the payment service, but I still own the payment data. And if I want to change payment services, I can still easily do that. So I think really the architectural patterns that you can have nowadays become more and more interesting and more and more flexible. It's really interesting to see. Do you have like any stories around where companies said, well, in the end, maybe we do build one ourselves? Is that something where you've still seen investments into privacy vaults, or would you say that this, like databases, so to speak, at some point there will just be like a few companies that do that for a living, and basically everybody else just consumes one of these products? Is that a direction where you see it's going?
I do think that's the direction it's going to go. We still, when we talk to, potential prospects for Skyflow, I think that does come up, especially if they're a big tech company. They might think about, well, maybe we'll build it, but there's a huge cost involved with building any architecture beyond just the original investment. There's also upkeep, and you're taking on essentially the longevity of like compliance. Like there's over 100 privacy laws in the world, and they change and update all the time. And most companies don't want to like spend their time sort of trying to figure out whether they're still, meeting various regulations or, what's going on in the industry. It's just a massive amount of stuff to try to keep up to date on. And if that's not core to your business, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spend that time and those resources trying to keep up to date on that. But I think that still does come up, but I think that over time, more and more companies will understand that, okay, well, it doesn't really make sense for us to do this. Similar, like I think you see similar transitions over time in technology, where at different points people thought like, okay, well, we'll just build it rather than buy it. But eventually what ends up happening is the companies that are providing these abstractions, what they provide is just so much better than what you could build or you could reasonably build.
Yes, I think, just from my space, right? The number of companies that I've seen who built their own API portals at some point because they said, well, how hard can it be? And then like all of them at some point say, well, it's not trivial. And like you said, I think that's also very important to like, which gets ignored sometimes. You also need to maintain it over time and extend it maybe and then do all these things, right?
And like the original engineer companies are fluid. So the engineers that worked on it, maybe they leave. and then you lose sort of a lot of that understanding and knowledge. When I think there's probably a lot of failed projects that start with the question of how hard could it be, and that leads to putting the company in maybe not a great spot.
Yeah, no, that is very
true. I think, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as data privacy and data security, it's not really something that you want to be guessing on. You want people who have the expertise to know what they're doing. It's not something that's like, okay, well, we'll figure it out.
Yes, and like I said, right, like living in Europe, I think there's so much stuff going on in that space, and I think I mean, not just in Europe, but it is moving constantly, like you said, and it's not something that you want to constantly have to update and work on all the time, right? It's something where you just ideally you can just consume it and make it part of your solution.
Right.
John, thank you so much for joining. I think it's a pretty interesting story. I like the idea in general, and I also just like how it's a great story for like this whole API economy and how it develops. And thanks for sharing all the stories and the insights. All the best. Thanks again for joining. Thanks everybody for watching. And if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.